This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a pain not chosen, of a hasty escape, of a fall that left its mark forever, and of an unexpected grace that arrives just when all seems lost. It is the story of someone who lost everything but found a place where he was not judged by appearances, where he was not seen as defective, but treated as a son, even while carrying within himself the feeling of being nothing more than a burden. His name was Mephibosheth. His story, however, begins long before the fall. It begins with a name, with a lineage, with an invisible war between thrones, promises, and blood pacts. Let us go back in time, before the escape, before the pain. It was an ordinary morning in the palace of Gibeah. The sun streamed softly through the high windows, piercing white linen curtains. The aroma of spices mingled with the sounds of servants moving about, preparing the royal table. Guards marched with precision in the stone corridors. Everything seemed in order, conveying a semblance of stability, but behind the golden curtains and walls, Saul's kingdom already trembled in silence. Generals met in secret. Messengers came and went, bringing war reports. While the adults carried the weight of the future, a child ran through the central hall, laughing. Mephibosheth, small and innocent, played with scraps of cloth he imagined were swords and capes. For him, the palace was a park, each column transformed into a fortress, each staircase into an adventure castle. He didn't know it yet, but his name carried the weight of generations. He was the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the son of Jonathan, the nation's most respected warrior, a loyal friend of David. Jonathan was remembered for his courage, wisdom, and compassion. Even as heir to the throne, he did something unthinkable. He gave up power for the love of truth, out of fidelity to David. His pact of friendship was stronger than any political ambition. He knew David was God's chosen one, and instead of envy, he felt honor. In those days, kingdoms lived in constant tension. The Philistines threatened the borders, rebels arose in every corner, and even within Israel, there was division between the tradition of Saul and the promise made to David. Meanwhile, Mephibosheth continued to play. His small hands held a wooden staff as if it were a spear, and he imitated battle noises, immersed in the fantasy of his imagination. Behind him, his nurse followed him smiling, calling out affectionately, "My prince, be careful." But he only laughed, running through the palace corridors as if he owned everything. He didn't know that this would be the last day he would run. A few miles away, in a field covered in dust and blood, Saul's final battle unfolded. The king, already weary, faced his final moments. Jonathan, at his father's side, fought with honor, but his fate was already written. The royal line was about to be broken, not by human strategy, but by divine will, to raise up a new throne, a new house, and fulfill the promise made to a young shepherd named David. Inside the palace, routine continued as if nothing were happening. Servants hurriedly cleaned corridors. The smell of oil and iron filled the air as if even the walls sensed the approaching tragedy. Suddenly, the gates burst open. The sound echoed through the marble corridors. A man staggered in, his clothes torn, dust on his face, blood on his tunic, and it wasn't just his. He had crossed the battlefield to bring the news no one wanted to hear. With wide eyes and a trembling voice, he looked at the guards and shouted, "Saul is dead, Jonathan too." It was as if time had stopped. The words pierced walls, halls, and hearts. In the next room, Mephibosheth's nursemaid heard. The cloth she was holding fell from her hands, her eyes filling with tears. She knew what it meant. The royal line was severed, the throne empty. And in the customs of the time, when a new king arose, the old line was exterminated, not out of justice, but out of fear, so that no one would dare claim the throne. Her heart raced. She looked at Mephibosheth, who was still laughing, playing with his wooden staff, oblivious to the tragedy. There was no time for goodbyes, only to flee. She scooped up the child and ran. Hallways, stairs, gates. Every step was a mixture of desperation and urgency. The palace was plunged into chaos. Servants scurried about, some trying to salvage objects, others merely screamed. But she had only one goal: to save the boy. Little Mephibosheth was frightened. He tried to ask something, but she could barely breathe. Each step was heavier, each turn more perilous. The fear that at any moment someone would appear to take the prince's life burned within her. And then it happened. She stumbled. Time seemed to slow down, as if everything were happening in slow motion. The foot slipped on the courtyard stones, the child's weight pulling it forward. Mephibosheth fell. His small body hit the cold stones hard. The dry sound of the impact rent the air. A piercing scream echoed. She ran to him, tried to lift him, but when she set him on his feet, he couldn't. His legs were immobile. Something had broken forever. He was only 5 years old, and in that instant, he lost the ability to walk. His eyes changed. The physical pain was immense, but the emotional pain was even greater. In a single moment, he lost his throne, his family, his freedom, and his dreams. The nanny hugged him, crying, trying to apologize without words. Tears streamed down the child's face, who now wept silently, without understanding. That day, the prince fell. But it wasn't just a physical fall. It was the fall of his identity. It was the beginning of a hidden life, marked by silence, shame, and oblivion. The boy who once ran through the palace corridors would now be carried in secret, like someone condemned to anonymity. The sound of war silenced the laughter, and the fall sealed the fate of the one born a prince, but who would grow up like no other. The place where he was taken said it all. Lo-debar, without pasture, without words, without communication, without hope. A forgotten village, buried between dry hills and sun-cracked lands. Nothing flourished there, neither the earth nor dreams. It was the refuge of those who wished to disappear and those who had nowhere else to go. It was there that Mephibosheth grew up. Years passed, and that boy who once ran free through the palace corridors now dragged his steps through mud corridors. In Lo-debar, life seemed to have stopped in time. There were no gardens, no feasts, no golden palaces, only the dry silence of the cracked earth and the invisible weight of shame. There, Mephibosheth grew up far from everything he once could have been. The boy born a prince was now remembered only as the cripple of the house of Saul. He did not choose that fate, but was forced to bear it. Each dawn brought the same routine, the painful effort of moving with difficulty, the curious and often cruel looks of others, and the constant weight of remembering who he was and all he had lost. As the journey continued, Mephibosheth kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to face the world around him. His heart beat wildly, as if with each step he were approaching a tribunal where the sentence had already been decided. As they reached the walls of Jerusalem, trumpets sounded, guards lined up, gates opened. But he heard none of it. Within him, only one voice echoed, "You no longer belong here. You are but a cripple. They will laugh at you. You are a disgrace to the royal line." Saul led, Jonathan, Israel, the throne. Everything seemed so distant that for many it was already forgotten history. But inside Mephibosheth, every memory was still an open wound. The fall had broken not only his legs, but his identity. He no longer saw himself as a prince, no longer as an heir. To him, he was simply a hidden person, an unwanted survivor. Lo-debar became the portrait of his soul, a place without fruit, without color, without a future. However, even there, in the most unlikely hiding place, God was already preparing something Mephibosheth could not imagine. The time of shame would not be eternal, and the one who felt forgotten was about to be remembered by the very king God had chosen. The scenario seemed too improbable. A man without a voice, without strength, without a future. But it is precisely in these scenarios that divine grace manifests itself most intensely. The past of pain and loss was still alive, but behind the scenes, God was already writing a new chapter for the broken boy of Lo-debar. Mephibosheth lived hidden in the house of Mashir, a generous man who also bore his own scars. The house was simple, almost poor. The roof leaked when it rained, the bread shared at the table was hard, and water was sometimes scarce. However, it wasn't material poverty that weighed most heavily, but the memories that insisted on remaining alive. Mephibosheth spent hours immersed in silence, staring into space as if searching for answers in a horizon that never changed. One night, sitting under the only dry tree in the yard, he quietly let out a question that had echoed so many times within him. Why me? Why did my story have to be marked by tragedy, by loss, by a fall I didn't even cause? In Lo-debar, there were no doctors who could offer healing, no prophets who announced promises, not even dreams to sustain the soul. There he grew, became a man, and learned to survive, but without ever truly living. Sometimes, as he washed his face in the small stream that ran through the village, he would see his reflection distorted by the waters and silently wonder, does God still remember me? But the liquid mirror didn't answer, only returning the weary gaze of a broken man. In Lo-debar, fear became a constant companion. Fear of being discovered, fear of being remembered, fear even of hoping for something, and once again being disappointed. The prince, who had once run free through the marble corridors, was now merely a fugitive marked by shame. Crippled in his feet, wounded in his soul, he bore a name reminiscent of royalty, but lived like a forgotten exile. Perhaps this is my end, he often thought. Perhaps the fate of those who fall is only to disappear. What Mephibosheth didn't know was that, while he convinced himself his story would end there, heaven had already written a new chapter. Even in the desert of Lo-debar, God's grace would find a way to reach him. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the city of the great king, the throne stood firm under David. The battles had been won, the enemies were silent, the nation lived in peace. But not all wars are fought with swords. Some, quieter and deeper, take place within the heart. David possessed everything a man could desire: wealth, influence, respect. Yet one night, as musicians filled the palace with songs and advisors discussed laws, the king rose, moving away from the crowd. His steps took him to the balcony, where he could see the city bathed in moonlight. But his eyes were not fixed on the landscape. They were trapped in the past. Suddenly, memories flooded his mind. He saw the face of a friend, felt the strength of an embrace, heard again a voice that had marked his soul. Jonathan, the brother of his heart, the faithful companion, the man who had risked everything to protect him. The memories were so vivid that he could almost hear again that oath he had sworn under the stars. "Promise me, David, that you will show kindness to my descendants, even when I am no longer here." That night the king could not sleep. It was as if God whispered to him, "Do you remember the promise you made?" And David remembered. The next day, before his servants and advisors, he asked an unexpected question. "Is there still anyone of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Silence filled the hall. Some looked at each other, unsure of what to say, until a name emerged: Ziba, a former servant of the house of Saul. When he was brought before the king, he heard the same question again. For a moment he hesitated, but then he answered, "There is still a son of Jonathan, lame in his feet. He lives in Lo-debar." David didn't ask if he was strong, if he was useful to the kingdom, if he had anything to offer. He simply said, "Bring him before me." And so the dormant promise was rekindled. Destiny, which seemed closed, was redirected, because David's heart still beat for someone the world had forgotten. The sun was already high when the red dust began to rise over the hills of Lodebar. A royal entourage with horses, soldiers and banners traversed the dry and forgotten paths. No one in that land imagined that a king would remember to visit them. But that morning, the impossible had happened. The king's word had been sent to Mephibosheth's house. The residents peered fearfully through the cracks while the soldiers stood before the door. They knocked loudly. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed like thunder. Inside the house, Mephibosheth felt a shiver run down his spine. The fear, old and familiar, returned with a vengeance. He looked at his nurse, now aged, who returned it with distressed eyes. Deep down, he knew what this meant. "This is it," he thought. "They've come to kill me. After so many years, they've finally found me." He considered fleeing, but how could he run with his broken feet? The door opened slowly. To his surprise, the soldiers didn't raise their swords, didn't accuse him of rebellion, didn't call him a traitor. One of them, in a solemn voice, simply said, "Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, King David summons you to his presence." The words fell upon him like lightning. His name, his lineage, and the name of David, the man who had been his grandfather's rival, but also his father's friend. His heart raced. Why now? Is it revenge disguised as kindness? Is it mercy or a trap? With his eyes downcast and his mind filled with painful memories, he simply nodded silently. He was placed on a beast, surrounded by soldiers, and taken back to the city that had once been his home. But he was no longer the same boy who had run along the palace columns. Now he was a broken man, carrying more questions than answers, and utterly unprepared for what was to come. Surrounded by soldiers, he entered the palace's great hall. The imposing columns, the luxurious tapestries, the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Everything seemed unattainable, too distant for someone like him. And then, ahead, his eyes met the one who would change his destiny, King David, the man who now sat on the throne of Israel, the friend who had once sealed a pact with his father, the same one who, for Mephibosheth, could be both the hand that would lift him up and the sword that would destroy him. The entire hall seemed to fall silent as Mephibosheth was led into the king's presence. The sound of the soldiers' sandals echoed off the stone floor, each step like a hammer pounding on his heart. He dared not look up, unwilling to look at David's face. His mind was a whirlwind. Memories of escapes, of childhood tears, of the pain of each attempt to walk on crippled feet, and now the fear of inevitable death. It was as if all the years of silence in Lodebar had converged on that moment. As he stood before the throne, his knees weakened, not because of the disability he carried, but because of the weight of history. He fell face down to the ground, powerless, as if ready to accept any sentence. His voice, almost choked, broke the silence of the hall. "Behold your servant." David watched the scene with tearful eyes. Before him stood not just Jonathan's son, but a man marked by profound pain, someone who carried in body and soul the weight of a tragedy he had not chosen. And in that moment, the king of Israel didn't see a rival, didn't see a deposed heir to the throne, didn't see a burden to the kingdom. He saw a friend. He saw Jonathan reflected in his son's fragility. The memory of the covenant made years before came rushing back, and David took a deep breath before saying something that would forever change Mephibosheth's fate. "Mephibosheth," he called by name, not like a king speaking to a subject, but like a father recognizing a lost son. The young man trembled, unable to raise his head, but then he heard words he never expected. "Do not be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of Jonathan your father. I will restore all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you will always eat at my table." Those words fell upon him like rain on dry ground. Kindness, restitution, the king's table. It was almost impossible to believe. For a moment he thought it was a trap, but David's gaze left no room for doubt. It was a sincere look, full of compassion, charged with the memory of a friendship that not even death had erased. Mephibosheth, astonished, replied, "Who is your servant, that you should look upon a dead dog like me?" His self-perception was overwhelming. He saw himself as no prince, no heir, no worthy of anything but oblivion. But right there, in the place of his greatest shame, grace reached him. David wasted no time. He called Ziba, the servant who had formerly belonged to Saul's household, and commanded in front of everyone, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his household I give to your master's son. You shall work the land for him with your sons and servants, and you shall bring in the produce, so that there will be food for his household. But as for Mephibosheth, he shall always eat at my table as one of the king's sons." The impact of these words spread throughout the hall. Soldiers, advisors, servants, all witnessed that the king was not only fulfilling an ancient promise, but also revealing the heart of God in his goodness. For the grace manifested in Mephibosheth, his life is a portrait of divine grace, reaching out to the forgotten, the broken, the crippled of soul. And so, the man who had lived in exile in Lodabar was brought to Jerusalem. What had been hidden was exposed to the light. What had been considered a dead dog now sat at the king's table. And not just once, not as a passing guest, but as an adopted son, as part of the royal family. At every meal in the palace, as the nobles sat down and their eyes turned to the man limping in his steps, the memory of grace came alive. There Mephibosheth stood, not by his own merits, but because of a covenant made before he was even born. His story was no longer marked by fall, but by restoration. The name once forgotten in Lodabar now echoed in the halls of Jerusalem. The wounded boy who once wondered if God still remembered him now had his answer before his eyes. Yes, God never forgot him. And every time David saw him sitting at the table, he remembered not only Jonathan, but also the faithfulness of God, who keeps promises, who raises up the fallen, who transforms destinies, and who writes stories where there were only torn pages. As he approached, Mephibosheth staggered, his feet barely supporting him, his soul even less so. And then he fell face down to the ground, defeated, shame drenching his weak voice. "Who am I that you should look upon a dead dog like me?" For an instant, time seemed to stand still. Silence fell over the hall, and then David stood. His footsteps echoed steadily, but there was a lightness in the air, a delicacy that contrasted with the weight of the past. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on Mephibosheth. There, he saw not just crippled legs, rags of poverty, or a forgotten man. He saw his friend's son, the promise made under heaven. He saw the grace that chooses to restore those no one remembers. David spoke, his voice thick with emotion and authority. "Mephibosheth." The name sounded like a call, a rescue, not an accusation or judgment. "Do not fear. I will restore to you the land of your grandfather Saul, and you will eat at my table all the days of your life." Words fell like thunderbolts of mercy, shattering decades of silence, ignorance, and pain. Mephibosheth could not comprehend. He, a dead dog, crippled, forgotten, humiliated, now found himself remembered, valued, chosen. There before the king, he learned that grace does not require perfection. It only requires presence and a heart open to the call. David ordered a place prepared at the table, not among the servants, but among the sons, among the princes, under the roof of promise. Mephibosheth, the crippled man, began to sit with dignity, to share the royal bread, to experience restoration every day. But there was something deeper than food. There, at that table, no one saw his limitations. No one remembered his fall. His traumas no longer spoke louder. Their scars no longer defined his worth. His story ceased to be one of pain and became a testimony of redemption, a reflection of how true grace transforms the impossible into a new beginning. The story of Mephibosheth is not just a biblical narrative. It is a mirror for each of us. How many of us stumble through life's chaos, marked by pain that wasn't always our fault? How many grew up in emotional Lodebars, silent, dry, hopeless places? How many still carry the voice of the past, telling them, "You are not worthy, you are too broken, you have been forgotten"? Today, the King asks again, "Is there anyone I can show kindness to?" And the silent answer resonates for you. You who carry trauma, who have lost your identity, who have hidden, who have given up trying. The invitation is not for the perfect, but for the broken, the weary, for those who still believe that one day they can be restored. The King's table is set, and there is a place with your name, yes, with your name. There you won't see the crippled feet, only the restored heart, the transformed life, and the love that covers the past. You may have fallen, but the King has not forgotten you. You may feel unworthy, but he still calls you his child. If today you hear his voice knocking at the door of your emotional load bar, don't run away. Just say, "Here I am," and grace will lift you up. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who lives hidden in their load bar, share this video. Perhaps grace will find them today too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring stories that reveal the light behind the shadows and the power of redemption that transforms lives.